Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are in the world. But either way, happy Tuesday, and thank you for joining us for a Behavior Analyst Talks about Discrimination and Prejudice, brought to you by Dr. Charles Catania. So thank you so much for doing this for us today. And today, during our presentation, you're going to have the chance to earn 2 CEUs. So the way that you're going to earn those CEUs is by staying the entire duration of the webinar. Again, this is one where we're kind of going down to the minute. So if for anybody that came to Dr. Winston's presentation about a week ago, or last week, then you know that you had to stay to the very end, the very minute, because of the 2.5 CEUs. Well, today is 2 CEUs for you to stay from now until 3:10 Eastern time. So it's about an hour and 40 minutes from now. So please make sure that you guys are staying the entire time if you wish to earn CEUs. Leaving early or even coming late can and will impact your qualification and your eligibility for getting those. Now, if you do stay the entire time, then you should also purchase the option to earn those CEUs in our store, and I'll pop that link in our chat box in a couple of minutes. But if you answer the poll questions that are going to be popping up, then that's what's really going to lock in your participation for earning those CEUs today. Now, if you have any questions whatsoever, go ahead and throw them into the questions box. Try not to ask about whether or not your registration is working, like if you've logged in correctly. If you see everything on your screen right now, then you are logged in correctly. You joined with your name and email. So if you clicked on that link that came from that auto email, then you are logged in correctly and you are good to go so far. You should be in a GoToWebinar app of some sort. So it's either on your computer or on your tablet or mobile phone. But either way, it doesn't happen just through your internet browser and you're not dialed in audio only. If you're audio only, then GoToWebinar is not going to be able to register that you are actually here, even though you kind of are. So please, even if you're having any kind of visual or audio problems with the GoToWebinar on your iPad or through the app, I'll say, whether it's on your computer or on the iPad or phone, then please also make sure that you dial in as well. Just having both just to ensure that you are definitely registered here, but then you can actually hear properly. We just want to make sure that we get the best of both worlds and you're not missing out on an opportunity and kind of wasting time, because we know how valuable your time is while you're joining us today. But all right, so there is a copy of the slides under the handouts. So if you wanted to download them, I also emailed them from support a couple of hours ago. So if you don't have that email from support, go ahead and use the control panel. Otherwise, if you have trouble there, you can send an email to support again, and we can send them there again. But all right, that's all I have to say for now. I'll say more about CEUs and poll questions when the first poll comes up. But for now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Catania.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is a continuing series in which I will be discussing various kinds of issues. I've somehow gotten into the situation in which it's looking like more and more of the things that I think I'm ready and interested in talking about are include some controversial dimensions. We'll see where some of that goes. But for that reason, I would like to invite you to, if you have questions, put them in, type them in chat, and we should have some time now and then during the course of the presentation in which Marissa can read a question to me if it seems like it's general enough and appropriate enough to the topics, and we'll try to handle it. Also, if you have a question and it turns out we don't get to it, my email address is Catania. You can see how my last name is spelled there on the screen, C-A-T like in cat, A-N-I-A at umbc.edu. So feel free after the event to send me an email if there's a question that you find really pressing that we didn't get the chance to get to. I cannot promise quick turnaround. And I often just worry about things getting lost in my inbox because a lot of email comes in. But if I don't give you a response within 2 or 3 days, then do not hesitate. Do not be shy about sending me a reminder. Since these are controversial topics, probably all of my presentations these days should have this kind of a warning. Some attendees may find some of the contents of this presentation disturbing or offensive. I hope that won't be the case, but it could be. We're discussing issues that have become more salient, especially in contemporary politics and the contemporary situation in our country and in the world. Much of what I'm going to be talking about does appear in an abbreviated form in my recent book, which covers the ABCs of behavior analysis. And I just, since those topics do come up both there and what we'll be talking about, I think I should mention that the publisher is making available a discount if any of you are interested in looking at that book, and the information is here on the web place. You can go and you use the BDS extension there to get that if you're interested. But let's move right on to our topics. Essentially, discrimination and prejudice. Now, discrimination is that word that we have all heard as students of behavior analysis. When I took my courses as an undergraduate, first with Fred Keller and later with Nat Schoenfeld, it was a word that was part of the introductory course. The rat in a lab could be brought into a chamber, and you might arrange it so that its lever presses produce food when the light is on, but not when the light is off. And you'd start talking about the rat discriminating between light and dark. And in those days, nobody even worried much about the possibility that this word might have different kinds of significance to different people. We're talking about a case in which there is some stimuli. You got to have one versus another, even if it's just the presence or absence. Stimulus condition 1, stimulus condition 2. In stimulus condition 1, a particular response may produce some consequence. Another response may produce a different consequence. The consequence might be that nothing happens, but we're very general about what a consequence can be. So once we see a change in behavior occurring, given those different stimuli, when response 1 in the presence of S1 differs from response 2 in the presence of S2, say in the rate at which it occurs, we say that the individual discriminates between S1 and S2. So that's some of the technical usage. And mostly today we'll be talking about discrimination in that technical sense. The pigeon pecks green but not red when only its pecks on green produce food. That's the standard kind of thing. I moved from my undergraduate history and most of the experiments being with rats to then later working with pigeons. With rats, visual stimuli are maybe a little problematic because rats are much more sensitive to olfactory and auditory cues than to visual ones. And in fact, a bright light is aversive to typically to most subspecies of rats. So having light on versus light off is a little bit problematic because sometimes when you turn on the light, the rat turns away and stops looking at it. So you get my experience in that original course, in which Fred Keller's introductory course was a lab course, was that the rat takes a while to learn those discriminations. Once I got to the point of having an opportunity to work with pigeons, things really changed, because the remarkable thing about pigeons, given their vision and all, is that you can get a pigeon discriminating between green and red in a matter of minutes, and things that seem to be slow and laborious working with rats became really quick and easy when working with pigeons. But as the years went by and I kept on teaching courses in behavior analysis, I would be encountering more and more students from various minority groups to which the word discrimination had a different kind of sense. And I used to sort of blow it off at the beginning of the class and say, well, I understand that this word can be a sensitive word to some, but in this course, we're just using it in a technical sense. So I'll ask you just to try to set aside that kind of worry, and let's just talk about this as a behavioral phenomenon. This is our name for it. Well, after a while, that didn't seem appropriate. And in the meantime, UMBC, my campus was changing a bit. It was a relatively new campus in the state of Maryland. It actually was founded in the mid-1960s. And it didn't have a lot of the historical baggage of some of the other university campuses in the state of Maryland. And in fact, the student body pretty much matched the demographics of the local areas. And then we got our new president, Freeman Hrabowski, who just retired very recently, who was an African American, came from Birmingham, but had a degree in mathematics, and was a really charismatic university president. Got the kind of person who, when you're walking on campus, would know you by your name and ask you something about what you're doing, and even remember it the next time you saw him. And at some point, he and I discussed this question about the language of discrimination, and he said, "Well, Charlie, you've got to talk about it." And so, figuring that after all, if the university president is encouraging me to do that, I ought to try it. So, instead of walking in and saying, "Well, this is a technical term, and let's just move on," I started talking about the sharks and the jets. And of course, I assume everybody understands the allusion to West Side Story. If you're a shark, you're a member of that gang, and you're walking down the street, and you're walking toward the corner, and there are a bunch of gang members at the corner. They might be dressed one way, they might look one way, they might talk one way if they're members of your own gang, the Sharks, or they might dress a different way, look a different way, talk a different way if they're members of your rival gang, the Jets. And as you walk up to them, if they're members of your own gang and you start fooling around and all that, everything's fine. There'll be one set of consequences of approaching them. But if they're the Jets and you're the lone shark walking there all by yourself, you might find that things get a little bit difficult, and maybe they'll be somewhat gentle with you, but they're likely to pick on you. Things are likely to happen. They're trying to get to you, and you will end up, based on the consequences of walking up to the corner, given you see one group of gang members or a different group of gang members, you will come to discriminate between them in the sense that one kind of response in the presence of that stimulus has different consequences than the same kind of response in the presence of the other stimulus. The sharks and the jets become discriminative stimuli, and you will as inevitably discriminate between them as the pigeon will discriminate between green and red. Once I had made that jump of using the human example, I suddenly realized that even though we tended not to talk about it, the topics were not so different after all. I used to think of things in terms of, well, there's this one issue of discrimination, which is mainly a behavioral thing, and the other stuff belongs to social psychology and all of these other disciplines. And yes, it's important, but we aren't the ones who have anything to say about it. At the point that I got to this kind of an example, I began to think differently about it. Now, the second thing that happened somewhere along the way, though, it still became troublesome to think that all of these other things that go on in which people treat each other differently, depending upon group membership, depending on all kinds of characteristics, is that not all of it seemed to develop in the same kind of way. And so that's why, as I've written here, discrimination is not the same as prejudice. Prejudice comes from prejudgment. You can be prejudiced without ever having engaged in the behavior of responding differently. If you live in a place, in some rural place in which there's great homogeneity among all the people that you mix with, You've never had the opportunity to behave differently of some people with respect to others, depending on their ethnicity or their religion or their race or their gender or whatever. But you might have heard things. And to go on to another Broadway musical, think Consider the Song in South Pacific. South Pacific, you know, is that musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein set in the Pacific involving during World War II. And one of the songs is, you have to be carefully taught. You have to be taught to hate all the people your relatives hate. And the point of that song is that these kinds of different ways of acting with respect to other people are not a kind of thing that depends upon having learned them based on contingencies, but they're learned on the basis of verbal behavior. One interesting side point about South Pacific, by the way, was that in the days in which it came out, it was essentially banned in the American South. You couldn't go to see that musical in most of the southern states. And the reason was that it included an interracial love affair among the other songs. So these two musicals for me have a certain special significance in that they illustrate this distinction between discrimination, which depends upon contingencies, and prejudice, which depends upon being taught the distinction without necessarily having been exposed to the contingencies. Now, if there are contingencies there, they are going to work, and some of them are really important. If you're black and you start jogging and you jog into a white neighborhood, you might find that people don't treat you right. You might find that you're more likely to be pulled over by a police car. You will learn about the neighborhoods in which it's okay to jog and the neighborhood in which it's not okay to jog based on consequences. Or maybe early on, you may be taught by your parents and may not run into those contingencies. And of course, if we get looking into the realities of what happens in the world, probably an awful lot of the things we talk about when we're talking about these kinds of topics are a blend, and they include a little of some and a little of the other. The question is whether we in behavior analysis have anything useful to say about this. I think the distinction between discrimination based upon actual contingencies and prejudice based on verbal behavior is an important one, but there are other things that we may be able to say. Let's move on to a few more things about this and to lay out a few of the things that I'm going to try to touch on as we move along in the talk. If you look at what psychology has done and you look at the questions of, for example, why I didn't see early on that this topic was relevant to what we do, is that if you look at research on these kinds of issues outside of behavior analysis, you'll find that, for example, social psychologists are not so much concerned with the variables that produce discrimination. They're not looking at the contingencies and why contingencies do what they do, but rather with its products. Does looking at this face produce a change in skin resistance? That face doesn't. So you'll have experiments in which young white men are sitting in a booth with a thing to measure the skin resistance on their hands, and they're shown photographs of people of different races, and you look at changes in their skin resistance. Their skin resistance changes more with some than with others, and now they can say, well, look, these people do respond differently. So I think we are one of the few disciplines within the behavioral sciences in which we're more concerned with the kinds of antecedents that produce these sorts of phenomena than we are in studying the phenomena, because just seeing that it happens doesn't tell you much about how you might be able to change things. And I have to confess right now that these problems have, of course, been with us for generations. Change comes very slowly. We do not have the leverage to do much about it, but maybe it's a start to, at least for us, to make appropriate distinctions or discriminations among these different kinds of usages. Another um, another point is that although human features such as skin color typically vary along continua, when you start talking prejudices, they involve verbal behavior, and these usually come to reducing individuals to members in a small number of classes, and they're characterized by sharp divisions. The language of race puts people in these separate groups as if there were categories and walls between them, but the world isn't like that. But words are. You can skip from one word to another. When next time I talk about sex and gender, I will be using these same kinds of principles to discuss how gender too is a continuum, not a dichotomy. And even though it may be represented as a dichotomy if you're talking about the signs on restrooms, if you start talking about the continuous dimensions along which people can differ, like hormonal balances, like anatomy, like sexual behavior, then you find continua everywhere. And it makes what the politicians are trying to do with these kinds of distinctions that much more troublesome. And there too, I hope that I'll be able to show next time that we can have something useful to say about those. One last thing I'm going to try to do in the course of this presentation is to discuss conditional discriminations. Conditional discrimination it may be useful because we can learn that some discriminations are important in some environments, but they're not important in others. And it may be that conditional discriminations are a sort of foot in the door that allow us to produce new ways of looking at things that are provide opportunities for change. But let me save the details of that. I want you to remember as I say this, that these are topics that as behavior analysts, we're only beginning to look at. So please remember this is a work in progress, and any recommendations you have would be helpful because you too can contribute to it. So let me start a little bit with some historical things. I have a history with respect to having grown up in an ethnically varied neighborhood. When I was both in high school and college, I also had some opportunity to interact interracially with others because I worked for several summers in Harlem Hospital in New York City as a summer temp, as a ward attendant. So I have some history with respect to these issues. And I think that history has made me especially interested in these problems. One of my early recollections is the way in which in my experimental side course with Nat Schoenfeld, Nat had a way of talking about some of these issues that I found interesting. Now, but before I get to Nat, I want to mention there was big controversy. Of course, one of the things, especially in the mid 20th century and later on, was issues about the role of intelligence. And instead of simply assuming that, well, intelligence was the thing that you measure, you might as well just measure it, people started to look for correlates between intelligence and other human dimensions, such as intelligence and race, or intelligence and gender. This was a big deal around the time of World War I, when American soldiers who were sent off to fight in World War I in Europe were actually divided up into groups, not only racially, but by national origins and all, and were highly segregated in those days. IQs were very explicitly invoked to justify treating people differently. And those kinds of things changed over the years. It made a huge difference that Harry Truman integrated the armed forces at the end of World War II. And then there was changes in thinking about what was inherited, what was learned. This was before a lot had happened with respect to looking at cultural biases in intelligence testing, all those kinds of things. And of course, we as behavior analysts have a different way of thinking about these global terms like intelligence than people who come at these problems from other psychological orientations. Dick Herrnstein was a person who started out in behavior analysis, also had done some work in psychophysics, and had been a close colleague of Skinner for a while. But at some point he diverged, and with Charles Murray wrote this book called The Bell Curve, which was instrumental in trying to tie intelligence to merit. And instead of talking about racial and ethnic correlates of intelligence, began talking about this as being a fixed and genetic component, and that the ways in which our culture worked was that it produced meritocracies. We're only now beginning to see how damaging the concept of meritocracy can be, because once people get into this meritocracy group, they more likely then to be able to pass this on to their children, and there become intrinsic biases that we now see coming up with respect to admissions policies in universities and access to certain kinds of jobs and all sorts of things. But it was a big deal, and it still is among some populations. You'll find controversies easy enough to find, and I'm sure there's plenty you could go to online if you look to it. But anyway, Nat Schoenfeld used to talk about issues like this, and one of the really powerful and or at least memorable things he did was to start talking about race and speculating with what if stories. So, for example, there were discussions about whether different racial groups might have differences in their average intelligence. And any measures that are made like those in intelligence testing will typically produce a bell curve like the one you see here. We have two of them, and one of them has a mean that's a little bit higher than the other. And therefore we can say that on average, people in the bell curve that's a little bit displaced to the right are more intelligent by this measure of IQ test or whatever you want to do than people in this other bell curve. Well, Nat started talking about racial distinctions and included a whole bunch of things that are relevant to this other point that I made earlier about our taking continua. I mean, we do know that people vary in skin color and height and weight and all sorts of dimensions, but in particular, if you give a lot of people IQ tests, IQ scores are one of the things they're going to vary in. But these are continua. So this business of taking things that vary continuously and chopping them up into categories and giving different groups different names is one problem we have to deal with. But the other thing that Nat pointed out was, supposing you do have this dimension that you measure called IQ, and supposing it is a really important dimension and that you can't expect people who happen to place way down here at the left end of these distributions, you can't expect them to do things, to learn as much, to be as competent as the people who are up here at the right end of the distribution, because these are the people with really high IQs. These are the people who are going to excel. Now, supposing you then say, well, since the group on the shifted over to the left has an average score a little bit lower than the group that's displaced a little bit to the right, let's treat all the people from this right-hand group differently than we treat all the rest. And pretty soon, of course, we're talking about a class of undergraduates, people are beginning to get a little bit worked up about this, and Nat asked the question, suppose we have a cutoff like we have, this happens to be at 2 standard deviations roughly from the mean. Wouldn't the simplest thing be to just take all of these people who are up at this high end and are going to be particularly good at doing some of the things that these IQ tests measure, and treat all of them together and forget about how they differ in these other dimensions like skin color or height or weight or whatever you want. The IQ scores themselves should be the basis for the distinction. And that was a thing that was pretty persuasive. I don't recall that anybody in the class came up with any powerful argument against the point. So wherever we're looking at things, one of the things we have to worry about is whether the distinctions that people make among groups are by and large really irrelevant, because differences in any case, even if they're there, even if you would give the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, there is an average difference, given that you don't know whether its source is cultural differences, its course is a history of failed opportunities because of the messy history of slavery and other discriminatory institutions in this country, all sorts of things you could come up with. If you only paid attention to the dimensions that mattered, all of that would become irrelevant anyway. So this is a historical point. It's another one of those things that sort of has stuck with me and led me to continue to be interested in these questions. But we have come to the time where we ought to stop for a poll question to make sure I haven't put you all to sleep. Here's a poll question.
Alrighty, everybody. So here's your first poll question. The measurements used in our hypothetical bell curve examples were student weights, GPAs, student heights, or IQs. And a blue box with multiple choice answers and a submit button should have popped up on your screen. And you should be able to choose one. And as I said, use that submit button to lock it in. Please do not put your answers in the questions box. It makes it really hard to try to keep track of everything, especially since your attendance is so important. And for some of these webinars, they get so big, so there's a lot of questions that come in. And yeah, so if you could use that interface. If you have trouble with that interface, you can throw your answer in either a Word document or the body of an email and send it to me after the webinar with all of your answers, and that will perfectly suffice for your participation as well. And if any of these are content-based like this one, if you get the answer right or wrong, it doesn't matter. As long as you are participating, it helps to get the answer right. So this way we know how to go with the presentation, whether to repeat information, but please make sure that you are participating if you need CEUs in conclusion. But alrighty, so I will shut this down. And it looks like.
And I'll demur just a little bit with Marissa in that she might not mind, but I do. I'll be disappointed if it turns out that an awful lot of people didn't pick up that was all about IQ tests. And I see that 18% of you folks did miss that one. That troubles me a little bit. It tells me that some of you were paying attention, and that's a good thing. So
yes, please try to get the answer right. But please try to get the answer right. I didn't mean to come off that way, but based off should you get it wrong, it won't impact it. Please try it. Please try on the poll question, please.
Okay, so now we do have a somewhat more neutral term when we talk about discrimination. Sometimes these days we're more likely to talk about stimulus control. When I write about these kinds of things, I do try to talk about stimulus control, and I have heard from students over the years, and particularly students who've then gone on in behavior analysis, that in their early courses in the field, the people who would teach these courses and toss around a word like discrimination without even acknowledging that it is a sensitive word a lot of the time, the way it serves in our culture, were affected by this. And so I think we as a discipline have to worry about that. If it sort of hits people just as they're beginning to learn about behavior analysis, and it is a kind of a trigger word. Are we doing ourselves a disservice and making it less likely that we're bringing people in and welcoming them to participate in our discipline? Now, one of the other parts of that is also that when we're talking about stimuli, we tend to put the emphasis on the stimuli, but really we are behavior analysts. And even though we're talking about the importance of the stimulus, what really matters is whether the organism is attending to the stimuli. We call that attention. The pigeon must be looking at the green key in order to peck on green. It must be looking at the red key if it's not going to peck red. And so should we look at the stimuli? Should we look at behavior? Well, everything we know about this suggests that we got to really pay more attention to the behavior of attending and engaging with the stimuli that are out there. It's what we do that matters. I think it's one of the things that also distinguishes us from some other approaches to similar subject matters. If you talk to people who are involved in what they call comparative cognition, and they look at things that birds in the wild do, and they look at a variety of sensory phenomena in other species and in humans, the tendency is to characterize things about the stimuli, but there's less attention to what you're actually doing as you engage with the stimuli. And you don't have to move around. You can shift your attention from one thing to another without moving around, without moving your eyes. But of course, things like looking from one place to another give us a way of looking at how organisms attend to stimuli. Discrimination depends on attention. This is just a quick little experiment. A colleague of mine, in the time I was in graduate school, George Reynolds, ran some experiments with pigeons. He had just two birds, 105 and 107, and both of them were trained to peck on a triangle on a red background and not peck on a circle on a green background. They pecked on the triangle on the red background, pecks produced food. If they pecked on the circle on the green background, pecks didn't do anything. And as we see here in the training session, pretty soon the birds pecked a lot when they saw a triangle on red, pecked very little when they saw a triangle on green. But then he did a neat little thing. He decided to see what these birds did if you presented each of the components separately. So he presented just triangle, no colored background, just red, just circle, or just green. Bird 105 pecked only when the triangle was there. This bird was attending to the form, but not the color. Lucky for him, for the purpose of doing this example, that bird 107, given triangle on no colors, circle on no colors, or green by itself, pecked very little, only pecked when the red background came on. Same training, triangle on red, bird 105 was attending to only to form, bird 107 was attending only to color. The distinctions here don't involve things in which we can see differences in the bird's movement. They were both pecking the key in the same way. Yeah, presumably there are differences in the way their nervous system was going and all that. But for us, what's important is they were attending to different stimuli. The one was attending to form. Presumably, we'd find it much easier to transfer to new form discriminations with bird 105 and to transfer it to new color discriminations with bird 107. Another experiment, another quick example. This is one that Hank Pennypacker and Brian Owada did when they were, I'm sorry, not Brian, but as I recall, this was his wife, if I recall rightly. Anyway, the experiment involved doing breast self-examinations, and they worked with models using silicone models with embedded targets in the tissue. And they looked at a pre-test as how many the subjects could detect, a concentric search, a radial search, or a search along strips, along a grid. And they found that the percent coverage was far more substantial with this last category than with the radial search or the concentric search, which has really practical effects, because the folks who did this kind of, I know it's a pun, strip search pun besides, but let's not go there. These folks were the least likely to miss a target, and therefore this was the most effective way to actually do the search. Now, the reason I think this is an important one is it really demonstrates that when you're doing these kinds of things, it's something active. You cannot do this kind of search without actual palpation, without actually touching and searching in a given pattern. You've got to behave with respect to the stimuli in order to be able to distinguish among them. I also like it as an example because it demonstrates that even with respect to these intimate stimuli, parts of our own bodies, we have to be taught them. We have to set up contingencies in which we make these discriminations significant, and people can learn them. Anybody here has any interest in going into issues in behavioral medicine? Think about all the things we might do to set up things to teach people how to distinguish between gastric upset and a cardiac event. Think about teaching the differences between what a man might feel and what a woman might feel in the event of some cardiac event. All of these things, discriminations that we tell people about them. You can read a brochure that tells you what you ought to watch out for, but can you imagine setting up a set of technologies in which you actually simulate these stimuli and teach them explicitly? Wouldn't that be a contribution to behavioral medicine? And of course, I love the example because it was developed by behavior analysts and demonstrates the broad reach of our applications. So anyway, making the point, discrimination is an active thing. It's something we do. It's based on actual contact with the contingencies, and therefore it differs fundamentally from prejudice, which is based primarily on verbal history. As I mentioned already, when we do a behavior analysis of discrimination and we start looking at the human social sense, we're doing something very different from those who do research derived from and social psychology, where they look at the products. They see how people then react to these different kinds of stimuli. They have very little to say about how we got there. But and then of course, having said that prejudice is likely dependent on verbal behavior, you have to be taught. Verbal behavior, of course, has introduced a whole new set of dimensions with respect to what we talk about. So let's quickly move on to another poll question. Surprise, surprise, real quick one. Let's see if everybody can get this one.
Alrighty, so the main distinction most recently discussed was, and go ahead and select your answer and lock it in. And oh, I did forget to put the link for the CEUs in the chat box. So here, hang on while we got this poll question going. I'll go ahead and do that. So this way, if you wanted to buy your CEUs and haven't yet, you can. You can do it whenever you'd like. You can do it while you're cooking dinner tonight, tomorrow morning. I'll be analyzing all the data first thing tomorrow morning. So here we go. Here's this link. Buy CEUs here, guys. Awesome. I'll shut this down in 3, 2, and thank you all for voting. So it looks like 73% discrimination versus prejudice, 2% said blue eyes versus brown eyes, and 24% said discrimination versus generalization, but 0% said black versus white.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Of course, the word discrimination, and that is the term that's often paired with discrimination. To the extent that you make the distinction between them, you're discriminating. To the extent that you respond to one like you respond to the other, you're generalizing. They are inverses. They do go together. So at least we can be somewhat forgiving about that one. I'm glad the other two were so low in frequency. Okay, moving on. I've already said a little about this feature of verbal behavior. that is, once you bring words into the picture, words are these discrete entities. The word red is very different from the word green. Green and blue are different words. As soon as you start talking about the colors, you cannot change the words continuously, but the colors all can be laid out across a spectrum. The spectrum's a continuum, but the words are discrete. And of course, dichotomies implies breaking down into two, but wherever you have boundaries, um, uh, you're going to have uh, differences. And I'm going to use dichotomies in a general way, but trichotomies, quadrotomies, and all of that would become kind of awkward and hard for me to keep up with. If you start thinking about our human social behavior, skin color in American culture happens to be something that's historically become and remained important, um, but it is not a discrete feature. Um, Historically, there are great mixes genetically, and people vary in color. In some cultures, that kind of variation is among Brazilians, for example, is, distinctions are recognized a little bit more, at least in some subcultures there, than in some subcultures here. But it hardly matters whether you're talking about uh, just race. Wherever you look, gender, I mentioned already that gender involves continuous variables with respect to hormones, anatomy, with respect to all kinds of features. If you started to look at socioeconomic classes, yes, you do have breakdowns there, and you can start talking about lower class, middle class, upper middle class, all of those kinds of differences that are often identified. But you know, if it involves income and things, those can vary continuously. And we break those groups down and end up starting then also to worry about things like um, geography and other kinds of features and our cultures have done things that have tended to exaggerate those kinds of differences, like redlining with respect to which people can buy homes in certain neighborhoods. All of those kinds of things superficially look like discrete categories, but they too represent continua. And even with respect to ethnic things, you think what could be more discontinuous than ethnic groups? And you look at the kinds of conflicts you have in ethnic groups around the world, where um, you can pick them out in any continent. But in fact, we live in a world in which there are all sorts of blends. Uh, you can have a person whose ancestry includes many different groups, and so, for example, someone who has Philippine parents on the maternal side and Italian parents on the paternal side, and so on. And also, if you start looking at cultural practices, you find all sorts of blends. When I was an undergraduate, one of my college friends was Jewish. His father had immigrated to the United States and grown up in an Italian neighborhood. And it turned out that he then ate a lot of Italian food. And when he and my father met, they became friends immediately because they both had so many things in common with respect to practices, but one would still have identified as Italian and the other as Jewish. But if you wanted to sort of put them in separate categories, you'd be missing the continuities that gave them so many things in common based on their common histories in the neighborhoods in which they happened to grow up in their early days in the United States when they were both, either of them were from immigrant families. So we have to keep our eye out. One of the things that we might usefully do whenever we have an opportunity, for example, in op-ed pieces that are written in newspapers about all of the things that are now going on with respect to transgender kids, is to make the argument that we vary along continua along these various dimensions, and therefore categorizing people in terms of discrete categories really does everyone a disservice. We ought to recognize diversity, and later on in this series I'll be talking about diversity in general and some of its advantages, but I'll have to save that for later, or won't get through this one. Okay, so verbal classes continue into dichotomies or into categories. What can we do? Do we have any tools? One of the things we behavior analysts have come up with is the discovery of equivalence relations. Murray Sidman started doing these experiments in which he found he could teach new kinds of discriminations by relating things to classes in which some things became members of groups because of the contingencies that were set up. So we have set up contingencies to make a particular word in its spoken form equivalent to the same word in its written form, and it will also have equivalence to the same word in sign language and so forth. And these equivalence relations cut across dimensions then, and as we create new ones, they can cut across existing ones. I mentioned earlier that when I was an undergraduate and a high school student, I used to work in Harlem Hospital. I was the only white kid working summers there in some of those days. But what I also learned when I was working there was that was differences among the different people I interacted with. And there were some who resented my presence, but most of them were welcoming and did very different kinds of things. And I learned about different groups, and I was making discriminations that cut across any racial discriminations that may have mattered at the time. And you hear these stories when you talk about people in different groups about, oh well, they all look the same to me and that sort of thing. Well, learning to distinguish among the people within groups creates conditional discriminations that helps to break down the other more general relationships. So we can be looking in those kinds of directions. To the extent that conditional discriminations allow new kinds of discriminations to be created, they may be a promising direction in which we can move. People who study equivalence classes, mainly they worried about how to build them. Then they worry about how to test whether there are extensions to other classes. But actually, some of the things we might want to do is break them down. Because if there are some attributes ascribed to some particular groups that really don't correspond to anything that exists in reality, what we want to do is break down those equivalences and create new ones that cut across the boundaries, teaching new incompatible classes. Let's be more specific about that. Consider the inner city. You're a kid growing up in the inner city. You've got a few sub-neighborhoods in the inner city. Perhaps it's a place where you have Korean population here, Black population there, white population elsewhere, Hispanic population. If these folks cluster neighborhoods, then it's important that you learn discriminations among these neighborhoods, because the real contingencies might be that if you're not careful about which areas you go to, you're going to get into trouble. The contingencies will be different. It does make sense to be aware of which are safe places to go and which are not safe places to go, and they're going to be different for different kids. But now imagine that these kids all come to a university setting. In the university setting, if the university is running the way it ought to, it shouldn't matter what racial group you belong to. It shouldn't matter what ethnic group you belong to. It shouldn't matter what religious group you belong to. It shouldn't matter whether you're a nerd or a jock. It shouldn't matter what your gender is. Now, we know some of those things have happened. We know, for example, that in math classes, women for many, many generations were not treated the same as men. But once you're in the university, it should be that those kinds of differences don't matter. And the only thing that really matters is, are you competent? Are you doing the job? Are you performing in the courses? And the character of the work you do in a university should matter. Now, it still means that if you're the kid from a particular neighborhood in the inner city, when you go back home, you still have to worry about which neighborhood you can walk around in safely. You still have to make those discriminations. You still have to worry about whether uh, you've got an enlightened police department or a police department that will tend to lean on some people of some groups more than it leans on others. You have to still worry about those. So the discriminations are discriminations, but they're conditional. You engage in one set when you're in the city and when you're walking around and you have to worry about where you go and where you'll be safe. It would be great if you could lose all of those when you come to the university. In the university, the only thing that matters is how well are you doing in your courses? Are you learning stuff? Are you doing things competently? And to that extent, universities may be these little enclaves here and there around the country, some of them better than others. Some universities still historically have problems. But it may be that there we begin the conditional discriminations that can become the hubs from which new social practices spread. We know that around universities, uh, political issues tend to be more, or political allegiances tend to become more liberal than in the more rural areas and so forth. Um, if you're interested in these kinds of things, there's this book called Pax Ethnica, which is about diversity in different locations and pointing out that that multicultural neighborhoods, uh, places where there is not one dominant group that can impose itself on other groups, tend to be better places to live and tend to be places in which fewer of these harmful effects of discrimination develop. Appiah's honor code also has similar kinds of issues. Um, now, um, we of course had the issues of isolated communities, how we deal with those kinds of things, but um, I hope I made the point that conditional discriminations are worth our study because of their relevance to issues like these. So let's ask poll question 3 and see if you've been paying attention.
Okay, everybody. The settings used to suggest how conditional discriminations can develop in different environments were, and go ahead and lock in your answer. I'll leave this one up for, ooh, wow, you guys are voting really, really quickly, so probably about 5 more seconds. And I appreciate your quick participation. Alrighty, 3, 2, and wow, thank you guys. Awesome. So it looks like 33% said rural versus urban, 5% said medical versus legal, and 63% said inner city versus university, and 0% said farm versus factory.
I find that curious, but okay. I think I mentioned in an earlier time that those of you who are kind of just sort of idling along and answering the questions mainly for the purposes of CE credits rather than learning things, these kinds of issues are being addressed by the Behavior Analysis Certification Board. And it may be in the future that the criteria for when people get CE credits may become more stringent. I'm not speaking for BDS by this, by the way. I'm talking about other people I speak to and learn about. So just a little hint, don't go to sleep during the presentations. Okay, and for those of you who were there for me, please, my apologies for even having to bring that up, but let's move on a bit. Um, talked about unintended consequences and things. One thing that often goes along with issues of discrimination involves segregation, and the United States has a a sad history with respect to segregated neighborhoods and so forth. But a curious thing is that sometimes there are contingencies that that can create segregation in spite of activity to prevent it. So, for example, social psychologists have developed these systems in which people can do these simulations where you're bringing people into these neighborhoods, and they're not particularly bothered about everybody being like them, but they don't feel comfortable unless one or two of their neighbors are like them. And so even though they have several neighbors around them, and the trouble is if you do things that way and people keep making the choices of that sort, it turns out that when you try to optimize this, you do end up with segregated neighborhoods, even though people are trying to prevent the segregation. So when this can happen, even among those who are actively seeking diversity, it's troublesome. As I say there, unintended consequences hide around every corner. Integration calls for careful planning. You've got to really work at it to make it work. And you've certainly got to get rid of practices that make it much harder for people to move in neighborhoods that are preferred than others. So, well, let's this is a little bit technical, so I'm just going to run to it briefly. It's essentially a way in which I tried to lay out a way in which you could have discriminations that cut across different classes. In fact, we have enough still to cover that I think I'll just leave this as something you can look at your leisure. It's kind of technical. Those who have some interest in experimental analogs of these things could see and hear possible experiments to bring into a pigeon laboratory and so forth. But let's move on to continuing some of these other sorts of discussions, because now we want to talk a little bit about verbal behavior. If we're saying that another way in which you can treat people different, come to treat people differently is because of what you've been told, then verbal behavior has to be a prerequisite for us to talk about prejudice, prejudgment. So what are some of the properties of verbal behavior? I think it's worthwhile to spend just a few minutes talking about the functions of language itself. We have a tendency to think of language as, oh, well, it enables us to share our feelings, enables us to do this, but I'm going to argue here that the primary function of language, it's not for conveying emotions, it's not for communicating ideas, it's not for sharing information, it's not an instrument of reason. We'd like to think it is. If you think it's an instrument of reason, I just ask you to look at politicians. Do you think that their verbal behavior is rational? No. Human verbal behavior has evolved, and it had to evolve because it had some functional effects, and those kinds of effects work very indirectly. Rather, verbal behavior is a very efficient way in which one individual can get another individual to do something. We've evolved this thing in which I could, if I'm in a classroom and I say to a student, could you please stand up? Mostly students do that. And all of my effort and all of my exertion was just a little bit of making noise. And these noises I made got this student to get up out of a seat and stand up. And if it happened to be a student who was one of the biggest students in the class, certainly something I could not have easily done by running down to the classroom and trying to lift the student up myself, which would have looked a bit absurd anyway. Now, what about communicating ideas? Well, if you tell somebody how something works, then you might be able to get them to do something with it. If you give them information about things that are going on, they're going to behave differently with respect to that. If you tell them how you feel, maybe they will start treating you differently. if you look at all of these other things and try to reduce them to more basic things, what you always end up with is, and what I don't see is reducible to anything simpler, is we humans have developed this very efficient way in which some of us get others to do things. And then we back it up with all sorts of contingencies. Um, uh, Skinner was writing about that kind of thing when he said in his book, Verbal Behavior, very early on page 2, it's effective only through the mediation of other persons. That is, it does get other people to do things. It's irreducible function, as in the first bulleted item there. Sometimes the effects are nonverbal. We ask someone to do something. Sometimes the effects are verbal. We ask when we change what somebody has to say about something. If I say something about your answers to the poll questions, I'm asking you to do something that's an effect on your verbal behavior with respect to those questions. So there can be, you can try to get somebody to do things with respect to nonverbal things, to go from here to there, to stand up or sit down, or to get them to talk about it differently. Some of what I'm doing here, and because it's so indirect, I don't see you directly, is to get you to talk about these kinds of issues in a different way. All the other functions of verbal behavior, we don't throw them out. We don't say they don't happen. Communication, truth, telling about your feelings, logic, they are all derivatives of that. And it's only if that changing of behavior works that they can acquire their significance. The functions of verbal behavior, we communicate items of information or convey our thoughts or ideas because of consequences that others may act upon them. We express our feelings and emotions because of consequences that others may behave differently toward us. The thoughts, the ideas, the feelings or emotions, they do not travel from the speaker to the listener. They aren't even things that travel. They are our words for certain kinds of things about things we do, things that are happening to us, but they don't go from the speaker to the listener. Despite what the politicians may say, they do not feel your pain. Only the words travel, and that only in a very special sense, and that the listener may repeat them and then may act upon them. So let's have another poll question already.
Okay. The irreducible function of language is getting someone to do something, expressing feelings and emotions, communicating information, conveying thoughts. Alrighty. Thank you all for voting. And I'll shut this down in about 3 seconds because just about everyone's voted. 2 and 1. Okay. So it looks like 76% say getting someone to do something, 3% say expressing feelings and emotions, 19% say communicating information, and 3% say conveying thoughts.
Okay. So now what I'd like to do is to spend a little time talking about some of the things that happen in verbal behavior that all have to happen together for verbal behavior to become this intricate system which affects what people do. Because if we want to worry about prejudice as being part of a verbal system, we've got to talk about the different functions of verbal behavior and how they may come together to do that. But while I've got people looking at this, I'd like to take a moment and ask Marissa, has anybody submitted any questions that you think it might be worth my addressing now before we move on too much into, particularly did people come up with any questions or comments with respect to the earlier part when we were talking mainly about discrimination and hadn't really gotten to prejudice yet? Because if that's the case, it might be worth covering them. What do you think?
No, there's actually no questions yet.
Okay, again, let me, when we conceive this set of talks about different things, my hope was to get feedback from you folks and to sort of sharpen up my ways of talking about these issues. So really, I encourage you, if you have comments and questions, please consider them. I do plan to save a little time toward the end of the presentation, exactly for this, explicitly for the purpose of discussing questions and so on. But now let's look into this. We have, in the case of verbal behavior, these various functional properties, and I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail in a moment. When we look at behavior in general, we have all these nonverbal kinds of things, the neighborhood in which somebody jogs, the different kinds of nonverbal things we can do, and they if you're talking about neighborhoods, the neighborhoods may set the occasion for whether or not you jog there. And depending upon where the neighborhood is and whether you're jogging or doing something else, there may be consequences of what you do. Somebody may stop you, somebody may join you and be another jogger who and you end up having conversations with as you go if you don't get too out of breath. At any of these junctures, you might end up talking about the neighborhood you're jogging in, or while you're doing it, particularly if you're jogging with somebody else, you might talk about the different things that might happen, so that you might talk about the consequences that might follow from it. You could start by talking about what you're going to do, and somebody might say, okay, we usually run at the, I take walks a certain with local groups certain times of day. So somebody might say, call me up and say, okay, I'm about to leave, you're going to join me or not. That can lead to that nonverbal behavior of going to the walk, or it may end up my answering and talking about whether or not I'll be able to manage it, and they may be social consequences. All of these things blend together. They interact with each other all the time. And in fact, I could put in more arrows than I've got here. And that's because we have these sorts of behavior in which each bit of behavior not only can be an antecedent for behavior to follow, but it then becomes a consequence as well. And you get these things linked together and you get these complexes of behavior. And most of the social stuff we're interested in, if we're worried about problems like discrimination and prejudice, get caught up in these networks. And the more extensive they are, the harder it is to get out of them. And so that leads to the kinds of worries about why it is so hard to deal with these social issues. But anyway, I've listed here the shaping of verbal behavior, verbal governance, which can act both on what we say and on what we do, differential attention, and remember, I started this discussion of discrimination by talking about how important attention to the stimuli is, to whether or not you respond differentially to them. And then another piece that's essential is that we have ways of getting verbal behavior to replicate itself. Somebody says something, we repeat it after the other person. If you're in the Navy and you're in the engine room and somebody calls down a command from the bridge, if you're in the engine room, you have to repeat that command. You're replicating what got said as the order for what you're supposed to do down there in the engine room. We write things and other people can copy them down. If I look at something on this slide and I say it, I'm replicating it, starting with the written form and replicating it in the spoken form. So we have all of these ways in which verbal behavior in the various modalities is integrated with verbal behavior. Now let's take them one at a time. Verbal verbal shaping is one of the aspects of verbal behavior that is around us all the time. But of all those features I've mentioned, it may be the one we're least likely to notice. So if you're at a social occasion and you have a conversation going on, somebody brings up something and suddenly everybody else around the table is looking at that person and nodding and smiling, and the person keeps talking about that and somebody else starts talking about the same thing, and somebody else starts something different, but nobody pays much attention, and that person's talk essentially shuts down. And so you've got the case where the differential attention, which is a reinforcer by different people around that table, and the different audiences at different times are going to shape up what gets said. You can see this in the way in which jokes and stories can get elaborated over time. A story that starts having certain characteristics for a while, if it gets told and passed on, and you hear it coming up again and again, sometimes it gets more elaborated. Sometimes pieces start entering into the story that weren't part of its original version. Our verbal behavior can be shaped simply by the attention given us by others. Audiences set the occasions on which verbal behavior has consequences, and they provide the reinforcers that shape verbal behavior, and different audiences set the occasion for different verbal classes. The things that people say will you can change in striking ways. A group of graduate students can be talking in a student lounge. If a senior faculty member happens to walk in the middle of the conversation, very often the things that the students are talking about will change dramatically, particularly if they were talking about some of the idiosyncrasies of the teaching methods of this particular faculty member. So all of these kinds of things are going on all the time, but often we don't pay much attention to it. We don't talk about the things that shape our own verbal behavior very much, which may make our own verbal behavior much more susceptible to shaping than a lot of the other things we do, where we as behavior analysts may be noticing that other people are reinforcing things we happen to do. I ran into that early on in Fred Keller's introductory psychology course, in which in the spring semester, it was a one-year course with a lab, Fred Keller talked about experiments by Joel Greenspoon, and Joel Greenspoon was doing these experiments in which he'd have a conversation going with a subject in the experiment, and the interviewer would nod vigorously whenever something that the person said included a plural. And pretty soon, the subjects in Greenspoon's experiment were talking in plurals all the time. They wouldn't necessarily even be able to report that that's what they were doing, and they certainly wouldn't report that they did it because they got a nod more often. People who studied non-directive therapy back in those days, in the 50s, discovered that the training tapes were not really non-directive. The therapist would be listening to the client, and it turned out that the training tapes had the therapist saying, good, how interesting, much more often if the client had said something positive than if the client had said something negative. So without even inadvertently trying to do it, they were shaping more positive kinds of self-statements. I got fascinated by that, and one of the later summers in which I was working in the New York City hospital system, I ended up working on a locked psychiatric ward as a substitute summer ward attendant. And I ran into this young guy who was mainly talking word salad, and I decided to try it. What the heck? And I started paying attention to him, looking at him, nodding my head. Whenever he said anything that had first person in it, I or me. And after I did this consistency over a period of a week or two, he was suddenly talking to me about himself in full sentences. The psychiatrists were not getting anything like that out of him. Because I was an undergraduate psych major by that time, the psychiatrist allowed me to look at the patient's charts, and many of the things he was telling me about himself were consistent with what the parents had said about this guy. but the psychiatrist hadn't gotten him to talk about it. Well, at that point, I was convinced that verbal shaping was real, and that was a great start because I later was able to use verbal shaping in some research, but that's another story and would take us a bit too far afield. So verbal shaping is one of these things that goes on all the time. We tend not to notice it, but we should be paying attention to it because it has other kinds of implications, particularly if what you shape is talk about things that you do. Because another one of these 4 important properties of verbal behavior that I want to mention a little bit is verbal governance. Once we're talking about things, um, sometimes we do things because things that others have said led us to do it. Skinner talked about rule-governed behavior. I think that's actually an inconvenient and potentially misleading term, especially when we try to use that term with audiences that are not behavior analysts. Instruction following is another, but verbally governed is good enough. And it's an example of a higher order class in which we're not concerned with the particular instances, but we're concerned with the whole class of different kinds of things. So for example, following orders in the military is a higher order class. You've got all the particular orders that you can be given. And then you've got the whole class of following orders in general. And the military spends a lot of time making sure that that class is well established. If you don't do something that your commanding officer tells you to do, there are a lot of social contingencies, some of which are unpleasant. But the thing is, we not only respond to things that other people say about things we do, we respond to things that we end up saying about ourselves, and we end up saying, I ought to do that. The more we end up talking about what we ought to do, the more likely it will be that we will do it. Not universally, of course, there are exceptions, but verbally governed behavior tied together with the shaping of verbal behavior can create combinations. So, for example, if a politician gets things going enough so that you eventually say something like, well, I'll vote for you, then voting for that person may well be what you eventually do. If you got to that point because your verbal behavior was shaped, then you might not even be recognizing that your behavior has come under the control of these other kinds of variables, which may be a problem in political systems in general. I won't go into too much detail there. Well, there are potent social contingencies that keep verbal governance going. I gave you the example of following orders in the military. I've already mentioned that it's a higher order class, and it can operate on what you say as well as on what you do. We've already talked a bit about attention to verbal stimuli. So just as it's important to attend to verbal stimuli, to attend to stimuli with nonverbal discriminations, the same kinds of things are important with respect to verbal stimuli. Verbal stimuli are related to different reinforcers. We look at some things more often than others. People watch certain news media more than they watch others, and part of it is whether the verbal stimuli there that they attend to are more or less reinforcing. Huge individual differences. And here again, this is a huge topic. One of the most important pieces of it is, and this is involved both in attention to nonverbal stimuli and to verbal stimuli. We are much more likely to attend to stimuli correlated with reinforcers. And if there are stimuli that we attend to that are correlated with aversive events, we're much more likely to attend to stimuli that involve aversive events about which we can do something than aversive events in which we have no control over them. So these again tie into the other things, because what we attend to, if we attend to other people's talking, we may be shaping what they're saying, and these things again interact with each other. And throughout all of this, if one person says it, the other person repeats it because they've attended to it. Again, we get all of those kinds of interactions. That then brings us back to that earlier slide in which we talked about the ways in which all of these things can interact with each other. So I've gone through these steps. Again, they are shaping of verbal behavior, verbal governance, differential attention, replication. They may involve tiny reinforcers, little social reinforcers, just nodding or smiling. But you know, they may be little reinforcers, but think of human interactions. They operate over weeks, months, years. We know how much behavior we can shape in just a few minutes with a nonverbal organism. If I can get a pigeon to turn in circles within a matter of a few minutes, why should we be surprised at the huge and inflexible effects of these interlocking verbal contingencies operating over human lifetimes? If you have an isolated group like a mega church, and people don't talk to you if you tend to move outside those circles, and people are much likely to attend to what you say if you say things that agree with the principles that have been developed within that mega church. And this goes on, and you've been living there over weeks and months and years, and all of the social interactions depend upon reinforcers coming from these folks. Should you be so surprised that this behavior becomes very inflexible? It becomes enmeshed in all of these contingencies, and it becomes very, very hard to change them, even in the face of huge social consequences outside of that environment. So I've talked about all of these four functional properties of verbal behavior, and would you be surprised if, given that I've talked about all of these four properties of verbal behavior, that the next poll question was going to be about them? Poll question 5, Marissa.
Oh, I was waiting for the cue. I wasn't sure if you were going to switch slides to start talking again. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Alrighty, everybody.
Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
no problem. No, I thought it was like a able to like make a note. But all right, everybody. So there you go. That was your hint to make a note because here it is, which was not included among our four functional properties of verbal behavior. Alrighty. And you guys are voting very, very quickly. So thank you so much for that. On this fine Tuesday, I am in Connecticut and it is so warm outside. I don't know where you, if you want to put it in the questions box, I would love to know where some of you guys are and how the weather is. It's gorgeous outside. But alrighty, I will shut this down in about 3, 2, and 1. Alright, just remember that participation is required if you would like to earn your CEUs, everybody. Alrighty, but it looks like 0% said verbal governance, 13% said differential attention, 16% said replication, and 71% said none of the above. All were included.
And at least in all cases, the majority selected answer was always the correct one. So there is that. So, by the way, I have a stuck set of blinds here in which I can't, it's been jammed and I can't pull it up. So I cannot, I have a window right here, but I cannot look out. So I can't tell you anything about what it looks like here, except we do have things blooming in Maryland. So moving on. None of this stuff, by the way, is theory. In talking about those kinds of phenomena, they are simply observable properties of verbal behavior. You can see them happening. These are things that happen in verbal behavior, unlike some other approaches which will assume mechanisms in the mind or the brain or the head or something. These are simply things that you can see happen. Nothing theoretical about them. They're properties of verbal behavior. So bringing it back to our Let's talk a little bit about the origin of and evolution of verbal behavior. We have gotten to the point where we do things with words and we teach people things to do, which include teaching them ways in which it's appropriate or not appropriate to treat other people. And we can't be totally critical of all this because even though some kinds of ways in which verbal behavior operate lead to prejudices and discrimination, there are also moral codes that have led to people treating each other better. And so our best bet here is just to try to understand as much as we can about where these kinds of things came from. So verbal behavior can have evolved in us humans only because we're sensitive to social contingencies. If verbal behavior has to do with getting somebody else to do something, and if that works mainly because the local reinforcers tend to be little ones involving social interactions, it's got to be social contingencies. Now, other creatures do things something like this. Various primates have utterances, those in which the groups tend to be especially influenced by a dominant alpha male. That male makes a particular kind of grunt or something, and all of the other members of the troop will just stop cold where they are. That's a little bit like having a single word utterance, which is analogous to our saying stop. But if in primate groups that has advantages, if the younger one is much less likely to wander away and from the group and get where it may be more in danger of being caught by a predator, that can be a functionally important one, even if they've just got that one word vocabulary. I used to be involved in some groups, one group called the Language Arts Society, in which there were debates about whether human language was millions of years old or just a few tens of thousands of years old. And it turns out that there's a sense in which both of the adherents of both positions could be right. Over the first couple of millions years of early hominids, the ones who are our ancestors, over those times, they may have developed what were essentially equivalent to single word utterances, things that would functionally be stop or maybe just some other things that had to do with starting a fire or something like that. And only eventually did words begin to combine. And once words begin to combine, then you can have the opportunity for word combinations, sentences, grammar, and all of the other things. And just as the Cambrian Revolution 570 million years ago would have been the beginnings of multi-celled organisms and the tremendous expansion in diversity, the moment when humans began to combine words and when grammatical constructions began to be possible, when words began to have different functions, that would have set the occasion for an explosion of diversity. And once those kinds of things began to be happening, if Skinner was right about that, which I suspect he was, then local social contingencies could begin to create diversity and variation over and above what might have been essentially just very much instinctive or elicited kinds of behavior. So if we start there, if verbal behavior is what we inherit, then what we've got to ask is, what is there about it that could give us some control over the kinds of things we worry about? And I've already gone through these. I'm not going to be introducing anything especially new here. This is essentially a summary of where we've been. Again, I don't have solutions. This is a work in progress, but it's where I see possibilities for the future that can help us to deal with what we see. Maybe there are people who might want to teach courses on how behavior analysis could be applied to these kinds of issues. One of them that I would talked about at some length would be to create contingencies that allow conditional discriminations, to create environments in which these discriminations can grow and eventually replace the ones that create such problems in other environments. Looking at the ways in which continua get replaced by categories and dichotomies, changing equivalence relations, and I'm going to come up in a moment with talking more specifically about some of those, and also in distinguishing between those kinds of discriminations that are based on contingencies and those that are based on verbal governance, which essentially then include within them prejudices. So let's talk about equivalence relationships and talk about a specific example. I've been fascinated by it. This is a set of experiments on equivalence classes done by Mickey Keenan and some of his students and colleagues up at in Belfast in Northern Ireland, where there are well-established classes. You have the Catholic nationalists and you have the Protestant unionists. Catholic nationalists are the ones who are likely to wear green on St. Patrick's Day. The Protestant unionists are likely to wear orange. And there are these well-created classes. They involve flags, colors, the people's names. If you live there, and of course they will also live in different neighborhoods. Now, one of the things that let's call the Catholic nationalist class, the ones here, as the first one, which will give the stimuli related to them, actually, let's leave that for a moment. Then we have these three sets of stimuli, A, B, and C, and one class is, these three classes are related to each other. And we have another set of stimuli, A, B, and C, different ones that make it a second class. So let's say that we could now take an Irish name and an Irish color and an Irish flag or a flag or some symbol related to Ireland and put them all together, and we'll find that whichever group you belong to, these tend to have become a common class. And you take the same when you get the Protestant stimuli, and they will all come together. But what Mickey did was to try to create new ones using equivalence class procedures in which the A stimulus and the C stimulus were connected by an intermediate node that came from the other group. So it would be if you took a symbol that was associated with the Catholic Irish class, and you took a color that was associated, but you tried to create a class in which the common bridging term was a name that is typically a name you'd associate with a Protestant individual. And with respect to the other group, you took an Irish name and stuck it between two stimuli that would tend to go with the Protestant group. And what Mickey found was that if you tried to create these in an equivalence class experiment, it was much harder to do that. The people who were the subjects in this experiment found it was harder to learn. It's more difficult to create two new classes if the nodes, the common one, connect stimuli that belong to the different groups than if they were stimuli belonging to the one group. He then went on and names, flags, favorite sports. You could go to the paper, which is mentioned there. So if the A in an AB match was Irish green and the C in a BC match was marching Irishman, then that one would be um, um, connecting a C from one group with an A from the other group, and it was hard to learn that. And typically, even by the age of 11, these kinds of effects were locked in. But the hopeful thing was that if you then tried to do these experiments with students who were attending universities where there was a substantial mix of Catholic and Protestant students, you would find that that it was a lot easier to get these things done. So what he was showing was that the mixing were tending to break up these classes. And so what this tells me is that experiments like this tell us that we need to study not only how these equivalence classes are created, but how we can break them down. Having given this example, let's now stop for one more poll question. Here we go, Marissa. Here's another poll question. We'll stop on and.
Alrighty, everybody. So here is the last poll question, and it is 3:10, the time that we are scheduled to end. However, there is more content to go. But if you've stayed until now, you have met your CE hours thus far. So I know that sometimes people schedule very tight within their schedule in order to come to these webinars. So I do need to say that if you have met your CEU hours, however, there is still more content to go. So please stay if you can to get the rest of the webinar. But alrighty,
and
I will.
I'll be going through it fairly quickly because it's just summary. But what's more important to me is I'll hang around for a little bit for questions. So that's summary stuff. Don't worry too much about the stuff that we haven't got to yet.
Certainly. Alrighty. Full question down. And here are the results. Broken down, it looks like no one said Ukrainians and Russians at war. 93% said Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. 0% citizens of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and 7% said Democrats and Republicans in the U.S.
That was a great response, folks. I got to reinforce something there. Okay. Thank you. Okay, just quick. I do just want to. I could talk a bit more about the kinds of misrepresentations, but these things are going to come up again in other areas. I've talked a little about this would be if we got into talking about the specific kinds of issues that come up in discussing racial issues. And I alluded to some of this in the course of the talk. So I'm going to want to expand on these kinds of things in the future when I write about these sorts of things. We've talked a little about religious differences, the Irish and Catholicism, the Protestant Orangemen, and so forth. We can look everywhere for these kinds of things across religious groups in Judaism and in Hinduism, in Islam. This tells us how widespread these kinds of issues are. How can we deal with them? So this is really summing things up. A behavior analysis of discrimination in the human social sense, we are more concerned with the variables that produce it than with its products. We have something to contribute that's different from what social psychologies and other things have had to offer. In the human social senses, we've got to recognize that verbal behavior is crucial to understanding prejudice. We can say all we want about discrimination, but if we don't talk about verbal behavior and prejudice, we're leaving out something important. And it also may be important for us to distinguish between the ways in which these things originate. We've got to worry about the sharp divisions that are created. It happens inevitably because of verbal behavior when in fact all of these dimensions are dimensions of very long continua. And we've got to hope that we can use conditional discriminations to create environments, especially in academic institutions and in institutions that involve behavior analytic therapies. Our practitioners also should recognize these kinds of things and build these discriminations within the places they work. So thank you, folks, for listening. And now let's, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
All righty, everybody. Thank you so much for attending once again. And as I said, you go ahead and use that link that I threw up in the chat, and you can purchase your CEUs there. I'll be analyzing all the data tomorrow. And that you should have your CE certificates by lunchtime. If you only need a certificate of completion, that's going to be delivered about an hour after we end here today automatically in an email that says thank you for attending in the subject line. Alrighty, let's get to Q&A. Is there any correlation between discrimination and social justice?
Well, I think they're just different kinds of categories. I mean, social justice, we haven't talked much about values. And so people who would come from what would social justice mean to a Republican and what would it mean to a Democrat? So I don't see them lying along even the same continuum. So I'm not sure that if you are concerned about some group having historically been tremendously disadvantaged, you have to identify what the group is in order to be able to work with the group and to figure out how you're going to implement some social justice procedures. So along the way, you're necessarily going to have to discriminate in some way between the groups. My guess under that circumstance, though, is that doing that is going to have a very large measure of verbal behavior. You wouldn't have gotten there unless you started talking about those issues. So in a way, it's a much more sophisticated, much more involved kind of thing, and we're just taking baby steps here. What I would like to do sometime is to move from talking about these kinds of distinctions, in which mainly I've been worrying about the distinction between those two categories, where and in many real human senses, they're going to be blending a lot, and getting to the issue of being able to talk about ethics. And I think we can move in that direction, and I expect that I will try to address that in a later presentation, because I think that the ethical questions have buried within them some things in which diversity and equity and inclusion are really, really important components. But I think they're at such a higher level of talking about things that I don't see those as being in any way, sort of opposites or on the same continuum. I hope that's helpful. If not, try the question, try another version of the question, and I'll try again.
Alrighty. So, understanding that verbal behavior has the main fundamental function of getting others to do things, where does that leave Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior? Can you briefly discuss this?
Oh, well, I mean, it's all built on Skinner's. After all, Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior began with the book. Verbal governance was not in the book Verbal Behavior. It doesn't even appear there. What does appear there is lots and lots of appearances of the word frames. And if you're interested in equivalence classes and its extension to acts and Steve Hayes's various kinds of things, you'll find that a lot of that is in verbal behavior already in the way Skinner talks about frames. Now, I talked about replication as being one of those important functions. None of these kinds of things would work if verbal behavior didn't get replicated. If you can't repeat what other people say, if you can't extend the influence of verbal governance by writing things down and giving people instructions and so forth, that whole business becomes less powerful. But it all starts with things like Skinner's echoics and textual behavior, and you have to have the verbal behavior occurring under certain kinds of circumstances, some of which is occasioned not by other verbal stimuli, but by things out there in the world. And to the extent that we're going to talk about things out there in the world and then get other people to interact with them, you've got to have tacting. That's their verbal behavior. So there's a hierarchy of different things in which each of these topics is a little bit of the substrate upon which other things are built. That's why when people have to deal with kids on the autism spectrum, and they really have kids who are starting out nonverbal, they've got to build all those little bits and pieces that would have been built in by the ordinary day-to-day interactions between the child and parents. But if the child starts out not making eye contact, and if a hug is aversive, then none of these kinds of things that build these little verbal precursors are going to be there. So somebody who's working with that child has to build up all the scaffolding on which the more complex stuff is built. And we can get up to that more complex stuff only by having these other simpler cases to build upon. And so, yes, we've improved upon some of the things in verbal behavior. We're making some distinctions that Skinner didn't make. But hey, look at where biology has gone since Darwin. Skinner got us off to a start. Some people treat verbal behavior as if it's, now we have everything we need. That, I think, is an unfortunate way of looking at things. No, Skinner got us a good leg up in getting us going on these kinds of things. But we are again and again and again finding ways to refine some of the ways in which he talked about things. So I think we're just getting started. We've now stopped crawling and we're walking around, but there's a lot more we need to do. And it's kind of neat to see that there are all these things that we can build on. We're far from being done.
Alrighty. Next question. Alrighty, looks like Steve's writing in. Hey, Steve. And he says, I particularly enjoyed the origin and evolution of VB. And then he said, stimulus equivalence discussion with the B nodes was very interesting. It explains a lot of the problems we're experiencing in today's polarized society.
Yeah, well, thank you, Steve, for the comment. I thought I maybe was going way too quickly in discussing that experiment, but I wanted to get the whole context in there. We have entertained the possibility of a later topic in which we could discuss specific extensions from things we have to say to politics. There's there's a lot we could talk about with respect to truth and lies and how you build a whole verbal system in which you get totally different interpretations of the same things that are happening in the world. I'm deliberately trying to avoid using the word facts. I was, with the just a little while ago, I was reading about some of the things that happened when facts were presented and then other people presented alternate facts, which of course were diametrically opposed. And so the word facts has really gotten degraded. And but the one convincing conclusion about all of this was, yes, back in the time in philosophy when people dubbed that the age of reason, they were wrong to think that language was an instrument of reason. An awful lot of language is casual stuff like, hi, I haven't seen you in a while, how you been? And chit chat like that. Only after you get past a lot of that do you get to the complex verbal behavior. that's involved in political things, but there are some things about those contingencies that we have to remember. The linguist Bollinger, maybe, I'm not sure how he pronounced his name, but he's currently the president, I believe, of Columbia University. Um, and it is if it's something like, if discourse is not to completely deteriorate, the lie must always be the exception. And I think what we are seeing is a certain amount of deterioration. And fortunately, it's not happening everywhere. It's happening more in some places than others. And it's happening more in some in groups that talk mainly to each other than it is in the groups we be more likely to want to associate with. So we got to be at least hopeful that some of this stuff is going to fall apart, and some of the stuff that's creating so many of our problems. But we've got to work on it, and we've got to engage with it whenever we can. It's tough to do, as again, we don't have the leverage. And of course, I am alluding to levers when I say this. Um, um, Political things that helped that to happen were some of the early decisions like Citizens United, which allowed big money to just amplify stuff over and over and over again. And clearly that's a political problem, and that we can spell out the contingencies about. And if we have any say in trying to change those kinds of things, we ought to try to do it. But anyway, I'd better stop there. Any more questions, or should we simply invite people to
It
come
looks,
by the? Go
yeah, it
ahead.
looks like one more comment says, so verbal behavior is the problem and the solution. Seems like a bit of a conundrum.
Well, verbal behavior is the problem, but the analysis of verbal behavior is trying to get at how the problem works. Yeah, if if there's problematic verbal behavior, um, see it's hard to arrange contingencies on verbal behavior. And if somebody if somebody only watches Fox News, then how do you change things if all the reinforcers are there and you have this system that interacts? Well, it's that interacting verbal behavior that's the problem, but the analysis of verbal behavior is not that. We study verbal behavior, we try to figure out what's going on, and if by looking at all of that political behavior and that verbal behavior from the perspective of behavior analysis tells us something about what's going on, then the next question is, how do we get that out there? We have trouble writing books for a mass audience. We behavior analysts tend not to write too many trade books. Part of it is that it's hard to get them published. There's a long history of cognitive interpretations and so forth, but it's much harder to get books that introduce our way of thinking about verbal behavior out there to a broader public. If we could do that, maybe we could get more informed people who would then provide the counterweight to the kinds of problems that are being created. But you need access to the reinforcers. And when big money is running a lot of this stuff, it's hard to compete with Murdoch, you know? So we got to do a little bit when we can. One of the things we can say is that whenever we turn out reasonable number of students who then will go on to teach some of our stuff, we multiply our influence. And that's why I think writing textbooks that cover this kind of material are important. I mentioned my book once already. I won't mention it again right now. But I'm occasionally now hearing from students who took courses with me some years ago who are now teaching these kinds of things. It's a slow kind of process, but we've got to try to get as much out there as we can. And I still may be against all uh, indications otherwise, feel somewhat optimistic that behavior analysis can still grow. And the analysis of verbal behavior is different from verbal behavior itself. And that maybe our analysis will begin to have effects uh, that will make a difference. I, I hope that's the case.
Alrighty, well, there are no more questions.
All
So I did,
right. Well, thanks for listening.
yeah, and I just wanted to extend a huge thank you from BDS and myself for everybody who is here, and to Dr. Catania for attending and for writing up this this webinar and presenting it for us. Without all of you, can't make it happen. So thank you all, and now we can spread more knowledge and information across more webinars with BDS. We have another webinar this Friday with Miss Dr. Monica Gilbert. She's coming back with motivational interviewing, so go ahead and sign up for that one. I'll be working on this fine Friday to bring that to you. But okay, so it looks like
Oh, and
that's all.
just should we close with an announcement that after all, the next one, I think it's got to be a sexy topic, right? We'll hope that people will come and hear about what we can say about, from a behavior analytic point of view, about sex and gender. And
Yes, on May 2nd, go ahead and sign up for Dr. Katana's May 2nd webinar as well. In our calendar view of our webinar section, you can get easy access right there. It's our, as I said, May 2nd, another Tuesday, same time, first Tuesdays of every month. But alrighty, everybody, thank you all and have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next time.
bye bye all.